Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce the third panel, The Context and Beyond, in which we'll have these papers by these four speakers. And the order that we'll go in is the first person to be speaking is Andrew Whitehead. Andrew is an editor of BBC World Service News. He's a former BBC Delhi correspondent. And he's also an editor of the History Workshop Journal. He's the author of A Mission in Kashmir, not Mission Kashmir, the movie. He's the author of A Mission in Kashmir, published in Delhi by Viking Penguin in 2007, which talks about the opening stages of the Kashmir conflict in the autumn of 1947, based particularly on personal testimony. He also was awarded recently a PhD by published work from the University of Warwick, and he has written extensively about Kashmir in the 1940s. His oral history archive has over 200 interviews of those who have lived through the partition, which have been conducted in South Asia and beyond. And that also includes images of Kashmir in 1947. So Andrew is going to be our first speaker.
Thanks, Natasha.
Everyone will be using PowerPoint, so they'll function from here.
I'm sure for many of us, Pavina Ahankar's words still linger, and I'd just like to say a personal thank you to you for talking to us today. I greatly appreciated it. I'm a nightmare for conference organisers. I'm really sorry, Dibyesh. I was invited in one guise to talk about one subject. I said I'd love to come, but I would like to talk about a completely different subject wearing a completely different hat. I'm a journalist and a historian, but I'm not here as a journalist. I'm not speaking on behalf of the BBC. I'm speaking a little bit about the work I've done about Kashmir in the 1940s. But there are similarities. I became interested in Kashmir's history because I went to the valley as a journalist, particularly in the 1990s, which were very grim days. And both historians and journalists seek to interrogate established narratives. And that's what I'm going to try and do with some images. There are three, arguably, nationalist narratives of Kashmir. There's the Indian nationalist narrative, which says they got Kashmir fair and square, and that all the opposition to Indian rule, whether armed or otherwise, is the work of Pakistan. There is the Pakistani nationalist narrative, which says that India got and holds Kashmir by force of arms, and that status is against the logic of partition, which is that all adjoining Muslim-majority areas become part of a new Muslim nation. And then there's the Kashmiri nationalist narrative, which basically says that Kashmiris have been deprived of agency over their own political dispensation by two powerful and feuding neighbours, and sometimes goes on to add that that feuding has disrupted something very precious, which is often called Kashmiriyat. The difficulty is all three of those nationalist narratives are in large part true, but they're also in even more part contradictory. If the Kashmir issue was simple, it wouldn't be so difficult to resolve. This road sign is on the Jhelum Valley Road as you enter Baramulla from the Srinagar side. It's usually, for fairly obvious reasons, guarded, and I suspect it probably isn't there at the moment. It's the memorial to the first Indian troops who arrived in Kashmir on the 27th of October 1947. And about 2 miles away, there is one of many cemeteries in Kashmir. This is behind the convent hospital in Baramulla. And these are the graves of people who died on that same day, the 27th of October 1947, but not at the hands of the Indian Army, but of an invading Lashkar, a tribal army from Pakistan, which invaded with the support of at least sections of the new Pakistan establishment. I found out about the story by chance from this woman, who is now buried in that same convent hospital, Sister Emilia, who I first met in 1997. She was an Italian nun who'd been at Baramulla since 1933, and she'd lived through the attack on the convent, and she'd lived through the killing of one of her fellow nuns, a personal friend, a Spanish nun, at the hands of the Lashkar. And this was a way-in to a very powerful story, a personal way-in. It's ironic that the way-in was through non-Kashmiris, but that's often the way that things are in Kashmir. And it gave me a way into personal testimonies of what happened in Kashmir in October and November 1947, when these guys invaded. These are Araksai tribesmen photographed in Rawalpindi on their way to Kashmir in early November 1947. Somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 armed tribal fighters came into Kashmir at that time, armed, at least in part, by the Pakistani army, and with some Pakistani army officers in civilian clothes accompanying them. What they got up to, in terms of personal testimony, is in part because one of the people that they held hostage at the Mission Hospital in Baramulla was a correspondent for the Daily Express, which was then probably the world's biggest-selling English-language newspaper. And when he got out, he told his story of 10 days of terror. The story is not simply about daring do and people holed up in a convent hospital. It's also about how the Lashkar failed to take Srinagar when initially there was virtually no military opposition, and it's how they alienated support from local people. I also became increasingly interested by the images and iconography of Kashmir at this time. And you sometimes think that you understand a story fairly well, and then something comes along and surprises you and makes you realize how little you know. So I was talking to a veteran Kashmiri communist in Delhi when he went away to his bedroom and took out of his almirah this remarkable pamphlet. Visually, it's one of the most arresting things I think I've ever seen as the front cover of a political pamphlet. Published in 1948 by the Kashmir Bureau of Information, in other words, broadly by the National Conference, and it shows women Kashmiris armed. The woman at the front is a representation of a woman called Zuni Gujri, who was a National Conference militant in Srinagar, and the photograph is of the Women's Self-Defense Corps. Just about the only time when women were trained to use rifles and grenades on South Asian soil during that year of 1947. Even more arresting, and this is a classic modernist leftist image designed by Sobha Singh, who was then part of the progressive arts movement and part of a remarkable concentration of progressive writers, photographers, filmmakers, and playwrights which came to Kashmir in October and November 1947. And in terms of the iconography, there was something almost startling. So this is the cover of the New Kashmir Manifesto that the National Conference, the main Kashmiri nationalist party of the time, and still the governing party in Indian Kashmir, put out in 1944. That is Marianne. That is the emblem of the French Revolution transposed to Kashmir. Even the National Conference flag, which is a plough in white on a red background, when in 1946 a leading British communist, Rajani Palm Dutt, went by road from Rawalpindi to Srinagar with a National Conference flag flying from the aerial of the car, he commented very proudly how similar it seemed to the hammer and sickle. And that was no accident. And of course, one of the first things that Sheikh Abdullah did when he came to power in Kashmir is he renamed the main square Lal Chowk, Red Square. Where else is there a red square? The New Kashmir Manifesto, 1944, a quite remarkable document, not very widely read, but it bears reading. People know that it put forward very far-reaching measures of land reform, which were eventually implemented. What they're less aware of, I think, is that it is explicitly pro-Soviet. It talks of the united, mighty Soviet state that is throwing back its barbarous invaders with deathless heroism. Its agenda included universal suffrage. It included equal pay for women, and this is 1944 in Kashmir, paid maternity leave. And then you go on to have a look at the imagery of Kashmir in 1947, and you find this. This is a picture taken by Ramchand Mehta of Mahattas, which was the Great Society Photographer shop in Srinagar. It's still there on the Bund. I was there a couple of months ago. And this is Nehru, I suspect, in early November 1947, inspecting the women's militia in the centre of Srinagar, and you can see Suleimani Takht, Shankaracharya Hill in the background. It's a reminder of the complexity of Kashmir at that time, because again, you do not expect to see photographs of Kashmiri women bearing rifles. The National Conference at that time had a very active left-wing movement, which was very successful in mobilizing and which organized a militia which both Sheikh Abdullah and indeed, as you can see, Nehru supported. In the People's Age, the main Communist Party of India weekly journal at that time, 2 pages of photographs were devoted to this militia, and the text read, "For the first time on the soil of India is there being built an army of women trained to use the rifle and other modern weapons of war. The women of Kashmir are the first in India to build an army of women trained to use the rifle. By their example, they have made Indian history. They have filled our chests with pride. They have raised our country's banner higher among the great nations of the world." I've been trying to track down veterans of the women's militia, and I've identified about 8 or 10 and talked either directly or through a colleague to about 4 or 5. And most remain leftist by instinct, and they regard this moment as the defining political moment of their lives. They were given an agency as Kashmiri women in public life for a brief period in the autumn of 1947, which they feel that they've never had again since. But there was a wider mobilization. Another picture by Ramchand Mehta from October-November 1947. This is the Bal Sena. This is the National Conference Children's Militia, with the National Conference emblem on their hats, parading and drilling with wooden mock rifles in front of the Palladium Theatre, which stands, but in a greatly dilapidated state, still in Lal Chowk. And of course, there was a men's militia too. Much bigger men's militia, initially described as a peace brigade, but they were part of what is sometimes forgotten, which is a mass mobilization on the streets of Srinagar in the autumn of 1947. The People's Militia, this militia, unlike the Women's Detachment, saw active service. Several of their members were killed. They were a pro-Sheikh Abdullah and a pro-India militia. They were anti-Maharaja, anti-Pakistan. And because it doesn't suit any of the 3 competing nationalist narratives to remember what they did and who they were, they have broadly been written out of the story. So what I'm trying to say is, and I'm saying it very briefly because I've only got a brief modicum of time, and I'm sorry that I haven't provided all the background that some of you might appreciate if you don't know a great deal about what happened in Kashmir at that time. But what I'm saying is that the Kashmir crisis as it began in 1947 is vastly more complicated with all sorts of different currents which you wouldn't understand by visiting any of the received narratives of what happened at that time. And I'm going to end on just 2 more photographs because I rather like them. These are the couple who are believed to have written the National Conference's manifesto. So the woman on the left is Frida Bedi, born Frida Hulston, a woman from Derbyshire, who moved out to Lahore initially with her husband, BPL Baba Bedi, who was a leading communist and then moved to Kashmir and was a great ally of Sheikh Abdullah. She eventually became a Tibetan woman religious and was for a while the most senior non-Tibetan woman religious in Tibetan Buddhism. He eventually turned to Sikhism for solace. But one final photograph. This is one of the most puzzling photographs I've ever come across. It's Sheikh Abdullah. He's clearly in a royal palace, and it's clearly a moment of transition because you've got all the portraits of the Kashmiri royal family off their hooks, and it almost feels that they're just about to be collected to be moved out or thrown out. I can't find out anything more about this photograph, apart from, I can tell you where I got it from, Omar Abdullah's Twitter feed. Omar Abdullah is Sheikh Abdullah's grandson, and he's the current Chief Minister of Indian Kashmir. He tweets fanatically, and at one point he tweeted... I think that's a neutral term. At one point he tweeted lots of images of Kashmir in the 1940s, of which this was one. And of course I messaged him back and said, tell me more. And of course I've heard nothing since. But there is something quite remarkable about it, because this is a brilliant professional photograph. This is not a snap. And you wonder who took it. The composition, Sheikh Abdullah looking to the left, but on the left. Most people would have put him on the right, looking to the left. And one thing that intrigues me, and which I'm going to do more work on, if I can, Henri Cartier-Bresson, the 20th century's most renowned news journalist, in Kashmir in 47-48. Margaret Bourke-White, one of the leading Western war photographers, in Kashmir in 1947-48. Sunil Jana, Madanjit Singh, pioneering Indian photographers. They were all there, partly because of the landscape, partly because of the story, but also partly because of their politics. Cartier-Bresson from a French communist background, Sunil Jana, Madanjit Singh taking photographs for the communist weekly paper, The People's Age, Margaret Bourke-White, distinctly progressive. Who did she lodge with when she was in Kashmir? Baba Bedi and Frida Bedi. So it all comes together. What do you take from that? I'll leave that for you to decide. Okay. Thank you.
So our second speaker is Professor Fozia Qazi. She's a professor at Islamic University of Science and Technology and heads the Department of Mathematics there. She holds a PhD in mathematics from the Syracuse University in New York State and has worked as an academic in the US for many years before she returned to Kashmir in 2009. She has written and lectured widely on mathematics and on gender issues and Kashmir. Her research uses, fascinatingly, the mathematics of symmetry analysis on the shawl, the lattice, and other traditional patterns of Kashmir to understand cultural order and interactions in the region. She's also a founding member of Child Nurture and Relief, Chinar, an NGO that has been helping economically and socially disadvantaged children in Kashmir for the last decade. She's also an artist and a photographer and often brings mathematical elements to her art, and her work has also been exhibited at several places in the United States. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Natasha. Delighted to be here, but not as a mathematician, as a Kashmiri. And I'm also giving a presentation as a PowerPoint, a slideshow, but basically to give you an idea of what it is like to be a Kashmiri living in Kashmir and in the context that we're living and the circumstances. And we are living in spite of everything. So the title, for those of you who don't understand Kashmiri, the word kosher has two meanings. It means the Kashmiri language, but it also means the Kashmiri person. And it is the second meaning that I am using here. The images that you're going to see here are basically images of daily life, sort of ordinary activities, but within, and literally within, a military context. And this idea evolved, I have to sort of say this in the acknowledgement section. The idea of framing these images in that context evolved out of a discussion I had with a couple of friends and former colleagues, Shannon O'Reilly and Jeremy Vaughan. And this was an exhibition that was held in 2007 of some of my photographs, and the idea evolved out of it. But what you'll see here are not necessarily all of those original images, but a continuation of that idea. And I also want to acknowledge Kashmiri photojournalist Javed Shah. I've used, and with his permission, 5 images for the frames. These are the black and white. They were manipulated a little bit, you'll see in a minute. Those are for the frames, and I just want to thank him, and he knows I'm here today. This was the artist's statement that I'd used in the first exhibition. It explains and gives a context to this slideshow. So let me read it out to those of you who are craning your necks right now. There is a veil of control that renders the kosher invisible. Oppressive control that operates through several layers of political and military power and aims to make us irrelevant. It distorts reality and stifles expression. It tries to recast us into something we're not. As it cloaks us in its darkness, this veil seeks to erase the vivid colors of our dreams and render them a uniform gray. I take these images to remove this veil and reveal the kosher that I know. These images are meant to give a larger context to simple acts, a conversation, a smile, a prayer, a celebration, or a chore. Each act completely normal and ordinary. Yet, given the backdrop of violence and oppression, these simple acts take on a larger meaning. They reveal our humanity that cannot be shrouded. I don't make images, I take them. I take them back from the controlling powers so that I can erase the gray top coat and reveal the vibrant colors underneath. I take them with me as reminders of our kindness and resilience. And I take them places so that you may know the kosher. And as I said, that is the idea, that you understand what it is like, at least visually, what it is like to live where we are living and in the circumstances that we are living. So let me begin. I had to bring in math somewhere. Disturbed area. You must have heard this term being used in the context of Kashmir. And I must apologize. I'm at an age where I have to use something for reading, and I continue to deny that fact sometimes. Kashmir is often referred to as a disturbed area. And what does that mean? That means governments are more concerned with restoring order. That means when tourists come or are planning to visit and admire our geography, they want to first ensure that we're orderly. But what does disturbed area mean to us? On a lighter note, the image that you see here was actually an area problem in mathematics. The teacher was discussing how to calculate areas. But what does disturbed area mean? This image was taken in Gurez, and the school was literally a stone's throw away from the line of control. This is the line that divides the two sides of Kashmir. And as I was approaching Dawar, which is the main town there, you could see the guns trained in one direction, and you knew exactly where the line of control was because the other side was there, so the guns were pointing towards that. So this is an area that is disturbed into fragments, and that's what disturbed area is to us. Inheritance. This is a child and her great-grandmother. You can see they're engaged in a very private, very intimate conversation. In contrast to that, you see the soldiers very much aware of the camera and looking at you and looking at the camera. Uncertainty rules our days and nights, aided and abetted as it is by the military gaze. But we carve a moment out of it for ourselves, a moment where we can pass on memories, where we can pass on history, our traditions. And we do this in the strongest and surest possible way, which is the word of mouth. And it is how we preserve our past and build our future. Childhood is freedom. This is a translation of a Kashmiri proverb, Lakchar go mokjar. And And this is the title I've used for this particular slide. When we talk about sort of passing on an inheritance to our children, it's often in the form of bricks and mortar, your house. It can be your values and your beliefs. And it can be sort of a future that you're leaving for your children. But in our case, we also pass on that sense of uncertainty, a taste of siege within which we're living. But the irony of it all, or perhaps the positive of it all, is that our children also pass on something to us, and that is a sense of free abandon, which is what we have inherited from our children. And this is what Lokachar is, Lokachar go Mokachar, childhood is freedom. That's what it's all about. And they do this in spite of the boots on ground conditions that we live in. Lines of control. You heard this term, line of control, several times today. If you look at the two photographs, the black and white frame image is actually from something called an identification parade, which has happened in Kashmir on a fairly regular basis. You're lined up, usually men are lined up, and they have to produce their identity cards, and they're questioned as to where they're going, who they are, and all sorts of questions. So here you see two lines. When we're controlled by lines, we're divided by lines. This is external oppressive control. When you stand in a line, in a queue, in an identification parade, that's oppressive control. When you're divided from your family, that is oppressive control. But there's also an internal, more voluntary control. You stand up in line voluntarily during an act of prayer. And there's a big difference between the two forms of lines. And there is a control that we want, which is the control, which is basically to control our own destiny. That is what this is all about. Rebel with cause. We have often been termed as insular, unable to look beyond. And this is a stereotype that has been used for us. But here you see a man who is wearing something that is very Kashmiri. These are the distinguishing features of Kashmiri outfit. The firan as well as the cap, the Sozni cap. And at the same time, he's quite comfortable riding a motorcycle. And this is the antithesis of the stereotype of being insular. This tells us that we are very comfortable in our own skin, but at the same time ready to embrace a new world. You've heard the term integral part before. This is a play on that. Kashmir is referred to as an integral part by the Indian state. We are a bone of contention. We have been subjected to wars of possession, territorial dispute, as we heard earlier. But we are more, much more than that. We're integral partners, free to understand the world in our own language. The image that you see here, this couple, they're bakers. And they had been married for over 30 years. And when I went to their bakery to take some photographs, they asked me to take a picture of the two of them. And they said, we have never had a photograph taken of the two of us as a couple. And this is a couple that had been married for, as I said, more than 30 years. So I took a picture, and the next day I gave them a copy. But this is an example of a happy partnership. A promise. We refuse to be cowed down by the gun. We conduct our weddings with gusto. And if you have ever attended a Kashmiri wedding, gusto it is, you will know. The promise of weddings, celebration, and continuity, despite all. Broken cup, mentored man. This is a translation of a Ladakhi proverb that I once heard from a former colleague. If you look at the two photographs, the potter, his name is Muhammad Rajab, he's a picture of concentration. He's focused on shaping a beautiful pot. But the frame image is that of man being beaten and kicked by security forces. There's chaos in the frame, and there is complete focus and concentration on Muhammad Rajab's face. The potter makes a cup, shapes a pot, but it's fragile, and it breaks, and then he makes another one. It is the adversity that has mentored us. We have seen example of it in Parveena ji, how the adversity that she faced transformed her into a very strong woman, amazingly strong woman. And one of the other things that has happened is this adversity has educated our youth politically. And I think they're probably the most, we were just talking about it, politically educated youth in South Asia. Fireworks. In a sense, we have responded to fire with fire, the fire of our resistance. We celebrate this kind of fire. We're forged in it, ready for freedom. Collective conscience. And again, you've heard this phrase before. When Afzal Guru was hanged in last February, the Supreme Court ruling said that, I quote, to satisfy, this was, I quote, to satisfy the collective conscience of the nation, end quote. In the summer of 2008, our collective conscience poured out on the streets of Kashmir demanding azadi. And this is a collage of photographs I took that summer when all manner of vehicles were passing by a window, and you can see even the window in the center. They were passing by on their way to a rally, and this was the Pampur Chalo rally. And you could see them in buses, in trucks, on motorcycles, all manner of vehicles, carrying black flags and shouting slogans. And in the window next to me was a young girl. She was barely probably 8 or 9 years old. And she was waving a black flag, cheering the rally-goers on as the vehicles passed by the window. And on one occasion, she was greeted by this very loud yell of "Jio Mere Lal," which translates to roughly to "live my sweet." And this was by a young man who was on a motorcycle. He was riding pillion on the motorcycle, carrying an enormous black flag. And when he saw this little girl, he waved back and then said, "Jio Mere Lal." And I will never forget the look on that young girl's face, the delight on her face as she understood that there was a sort of someone else had responded to what she was doing. Sort of the endorsement of that shared sentiment that they had. And finally, our point of view. From our point of view, it is difficult to tell the future, what it looks like. Yet, we continue to look, to cultivate perspectives, and to define. And as the dispute lingers, the definitions crystallize to tell us exactly what we mean by azadi. Thank you.
Thank you, Fozia. That was really interesting. I mean, I think the visual exploration of the disjunctures between the poetic and the political. And again, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. The third speaker that we have is, and I'm guessing she'll also be showing us some images. Yes, is Professor Ananya Jahanara Kabir. Some of us are privileged enough to be on her Facebook, so we get to know everything she does, which is quite a lot, as you'll see from the range I'll just tell you about. She's a professor of English literature at the Department of English, King's College London. She's a literary and cultural historian who works at the intersection of embodiment, memory, and affect work and post-trauma in the global south, with a view to understanding better the regimes and the pleasures of modernity. She's the author of Territory of Desire, Representing the Valley of Kashmir, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2009, and of Partitions, Post-Amnesias, 1947, 1971, and Contemporary South Asia, published in 2013 by Women Unlimited. She's currently directing a 5-year project called Modern Moves on Afro-Diasporic Rhythm, Cultures, and Modernity, which is funded by an European Research Council advanced grant. And she has, for a long time, been invested in forms of Kashmiri self-representation, and her recent work in this area focuses on the new forms of cultural production emerging from Kashmir, which range from Facebook groups to hip-hop to graphic novels. Thank you, Ananya.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. What can I say? It's really an amazing moment for all of us invested in Kashmir to be here. We can only congratulate and thank Dr. Dibyesh Anand for making it happen. And yeah, I will get there too. And it was just a very moving and important moment for all of us to hear Parveena Iyengarji here and to hear you speak in Koshur. That was extremely powerful, because we don't hear the sounds of this language. A lot of my earlier work was about this issue, why it's such an ancient language, Koshur, and with an amazing culture of creativity and philosophy embedded in it. And you even try to learn it anywhere in the world, you will not even find a course. I tried. So there are many things that are very fundamental in the way a culture and a community and a group represents itself. And my interest has always been from the perspective in the perspective of the long-standing political conflict in the area we are interested in, which is now politically divided in a very complex way between nations. How even the idea of sovereignty can form when often many things that we take for granted in the post-colonial world, like the language of one's own mother tongue in a public sphere which recognizes it, is not even heard outside a very specific space. So that is why, for me, it was amazing to hear just the discussion going on earlier today. What I want to do today is I guess move on from that earlier work I've done, which is trying to look at the disjunction between how Kashmir is perceived and represented by outside groups external to indigenous Kashmiris, and what Kashmiris feel about their space and its history. And we've come to a position, I feel now, in the last almost a decade now, well, at least 5 or 6 years, where we can, for different reasons, hear more of this self-representation, see more of it. I think even what we heard today with Professor Fozia Qazi's presentation was an excellent example of this emergent seizing of different kinds of modes of self-representation to just be in a new kind of a global public sphere. So that's why, in honor actually of a term that Dibyesh coined on Facebook Kashmir, I have titled my talk, Facebook Kashmir, and other what I call cyber memory portals, doorways. Well, let me go a little bit deeper into the topic, and I know we don't have too much time, so it will be quite synoptic, but of course, we can explore the issues in, hopefully, in the subsequent discussions. Now, I want to start with two quotes which juxtapose the cultural critic Judith Butler talking about the body, the vulnerable body, bound up in a network of relations. And I want to juxtapose that with the words of Mirza Waheed, who we have with us today in the room, talking about a very specific body. And that, of course, is the body of Afzal Guru. We have just heard a reference to him and the scandal around the surreptitious hanging of him by the Indian state. So these two quotes, I think, I would like to make, to consider them together in dialogue with each other to bring us to this kind of reconsideration, which I'd like to urge on us, of the Kashmiri body, the body of the Kashmiri person, the kosher body, to use the word that Professor Qazi brought back to the vocabulary today. This body is bound up in networks, and not just the kinds of networks that Judith Butler is talking about, the networks of the street, the networks, physical networks, but also social networks. And I want us to think, therefore, about new strategies of resistance that we can perhaps glimpse in Indian Kashmir, which is a conflict zone, at least since the moment of South Asia's decolonization. In 1947, we had a very interesting paper again today that took us straight back to that moment, and how we should really consider that moment too in all its complexities, not a moment. There are many things going on, even in that thing that we think of as epochal, you know. So thank you for that paper. What I had done in my book was to show how even before 1947, there was this relationship between colonial modernity and fantasy that formed during the late 19th century, not least because of the entry of photographers in the space, and these photographers, who's perhaps the end of that phenomenon we see in the photographers that Andrew Whitehead cited. These photographers generated the valley as a space of desire and of idealized natural beauty, and I call that in my book the territory of desire, and that's the title of the book. And what is very interesting is that this has been a very tenacious process. We saw it even in countless number of Bollywood films, and films that we don't even, from the period we don't even call Bollywood, just Hindi popular films from the 1960s. What is fascinating is that today I see very strong evidence of this this capture of Kashmir through representation, through other forms of representation. This is being challenged on many ways, and most evidently, I think, through social media. Social media is fascinating because, of course, it means that when you're using the internet and forms of social media that use the internet, you are disembodied. Your body is not involved, you know. You're in a virtual reality. And yet, the particular contours of Facebook Kashmir, I think, remains entangled with the body in very interesting ways. And for those of us analyzing cultural politics, I think this entanglement makes it very specific, makes the whole Kashmiri situation very specific. Of course, the body has always been there. Let us even think about, remember the words of the late poet Agha Shahid Ali. I could cite any of his poems, but I'm just going to go to that very famous one. I won't tell your father that you have died, Rizwan, but where has your shadow fallen, like cloth on the tomb of which saint, or the body of which unburied boy in the mountains, bullet-torn like you, his blood sheer rubies on Himalayan snow. And in this quote, we can see that the Kashmiri body is seen as shedding its blood through the violence enacted on it by various biopolitical regimes. But in shedding that blood, it reclaims the landscape. It is sanctified through the turn to Sufism, to the tomb of a particular saint. It's transformed in that way into some kind of a durability which is evoked through rubies. This is translucent, it's lapid, it's hard, it remains, and it's off the space. It's something precious. So this return time and time again to the body, and often the body in death, is, we can call it, I like to call it, a kind of cryptopolitics, the politics of the crypt, which is also the grave. I'm very interested, again, how this cryptopolitics, which is an old tendency, I have, again, analyzed in a whole chapter in my book, how different kinds of Kashmiri writers in different languages, for example, go back to the idea of the crypt. But now we see this cryptopolitics passing through these new memory portals, which, for example, Facebook pages, promote or make possible. And I'm not going to go too much into the idea of cryptopolitics and why I called it that, again, because, it's better to really keep it simple here and, give you a flavor of the kind of analysis I've been doing with the Kashmiri material. I have, again, it's developed, that argument for cryptopolitics is developed in detail in my book. But what I really want to, again, point to here are the changes in that old way of using the idea of the grave, the disappeared body, the body in the landscape as resistance, but now, as I said, using new and different means. And this, this new moving through the memory portals of Facebook Kashmir, also interestingly remains entangled with another very long-standing tendency in the representation of Kashmir and all attempts to take that representation back by Kashmiris. And this is the idea of the pastoral. Now, the pastoral, again, is a technical term that we use from English literature to designate any kind of idealized representation of landscape. Typically, also, the pastoral is shown as devoid of any relationship with economic labor. So it's like just a place where people relax and hang out, enjoying the beauty of nature without any kind of pain, coercion, connection to any sort of wider politics and so on. And of course, you will see how easily, I think, or useful the term of the pastoral is to try and understand why Kashmir has repeatedly been presented as a certain kind of idealized space. What is fascinating, again, to me is that one would imagine that if the whole world is invested in showing Kashmir as this beautiful space which lies outside of politics precisely because of its beauty, then the normal, an intuitive response would be, well, then Kashmiris must be rejecting the beauty of this place. But no, most Kashmiri cultural producers insist that this is a beautiful space. It is their space. So I find this very interesting that the idea of the pastoral is also used in counter-representation. And again, this is becoming very interestingly apparent in a number of new cultural products that we are able to kind of observe today. I only need to mention in this company Mirza Waheed's fictional depiction of a nomadic shepherd community in his novel The Collaborator, which literally, because the idea of the pastoral is connected with shepherds through the idea of the pastor or the person who tends the sheep. And this is about a shepherd community. Among other things. And of course, you also have someone like Kashmiri cartoonist Malik Sajjad using the endangered Hangul deer, over and over again as a symbol for his Kashmiri selfhood. And that's most prominently seen in his website, Kashmir in Black and White. So that's the image. There is an image. You can see the Hangul heads all the way down there. Yeah. Of course, I've also noted there the new, again, we see new modes of resistance from Kashmir in the form of the anthology of occupation and resistance. We have Shah in the room as well. All these new texts, I think, emerging in the last few years participate in a kind of movement that both recognizes the way Kashmir's desirability has been constructed, but it also says we need to reclaim it for our collective healing as Kashmiris. And I think that this new phase of resistance really emerged by 2010 through the combined stimuli of unfolding events in the Arab world and increased resource to internet resources by all these different parties. So Facebook, YouTube, blogs, and online journals proliferated, enabling a new generation of Kashmiris to talk relatively freely among themselves, to dialogue with older generations and Kashmiris in diaspora, and also invite the world to hear the conversation, because anybody can access these materials. And this Facebook, I think, especially with its comments and sharing functions, really allows this kind of dialogue, multi-party dialogue, literally, to carry on. Facebook profile pages of individual Kashmiris, as well as event pages, began functioning again as what I call memory portals. There were interfaces between users and new forms of collective memory. And these new forms were also just interpenetrated with the memory of older modes of memorialization. So you have different kinds of memorializations interacting with each other. And these portals, therefore, open out also into simultaneous digital and print forms. So you have books that anthologize essays, essays uploaded onto online journals, YouTube videos of soldiers cracking down on youth, essays about those videos. You have Kashmiri protest rap. I'm really sad that the opportunity to actually be in dialogue with Roshan Elahi was not with us today, but we know his work. But then there are documentaries about him, and you can access them too. So there's a really interesting proliferation where there was previously very little. We must look to the internet and to Facebook as having enabled a lot of this. Now, these developments, how much time do I have?
Minutes.
How much?
Couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes, okay. I'll just quickly go through ways in which this Facebook Kashmir has enabled the dialogue with older generations, pre-Facebook, if you like, I've been talking about, and some images here might be precious to us to view. This is the Kashmiri artist Masood Hussain with his work Bodies Beyond. This work is called Beyond the Canvas, and it is about women and disappeared bodies. Most of you are familiar with the context. I'm not going to talk about it much, but I want you to note the dove carrying the electronic device in its beak. And for Masood Saab, he explains to me that this is like a telephone or, iPhone or something. It's some small portable electronic device, and it is the dove that is carrying it. This is his daughter, who is seeing this. Her line of sight is directly at the dove, hoping for a better future, as he says, as he describes it to me. This is the portrait of the very well-known Lady Mugli, who was found dead in 2010 with her eyes open, waiting for her son to return. And this is Rafika, who is waiting for her husband with her son, and the photograph. These are all, so the painting, how the painting is representing photographs and indexical reality is another question altogether. We can talk for hours on it. I don't have the hours, I have only minutes, so let me move on. Just to say that I first saw this painting as Masood Saab's Facebook profile image. And earlier, I had to go to Delhi and go to Kashmir to really see his works in person. It's interesting that now with Facebook, it's both good and bad, if you see what I mean. I can access it immediately and talk to him on Facebook, but I haven't made that journey to actually perhaps see it in reality. This image is actually part of a documentary made by an Iranian filmmaker called Mohsin Barmahani, but more on that later. A whole promotional video for the documentary also exists on, online, so we can actually see all these things in relation to each other. Going back to the idea of Facebook Kashmir. Very quickly, wrapping up, most of us have followed very avidly the developments around the martyrdom of Afzal Guru, and Facebook again was a way in which this happened. The crypto politics returns here in a way, I would say, around the very precise event of his empty and his body and the grave, which then mimetically sprung up, if you see what I mean, in Srinagar. And we have, again, I quote Mirza Wahid here, talking in another context about this issue and how there was an actual reiteration of the martyrdom of an earlier martyr, shall we say. So we have the same epitaphs almost being used for both individuals, for both these events. And then very quickly we had an amazing proliferation of poetry. Again, I have made a large collection of these. We can only show you glimpses, which again were written mostly in English, interestingly, going back to the idea of an international audience being sought for this sort of public lamentation. Facebook often quoted poems which came on blogs. And then others wrote poems which were cited and quoted by others, other Facebook users who were linked to the authors, and so on. So I think I'm going to end here then with just a very brief summing up comment that what we see today then is a real layering of different kinds of affective and emotional resources, both vernacular and global, both embodied and disembodied. But that entanglement is really what makes the whole use of the internet, and particularly Facebook, in this context of new modes of Kashmiri resistance, particularly crucial and specific to Kashmir. And as I said, the use of Facebook even by older generations of cultural producers who continue to work in their media, but now use the cyber media as well. So we need to find ways to conceptualize as well as mobilize these developments, which mesh virtual and real through this porousness of embodiment and disembodiment. We really, I think, need to think, therefore, this is a way to think anew, not just about the context, but also the beyond in Kashmir, and how we as analysts and people interested in taking our analysis to what's going on in that space, we must attend to the transformation of all our bodies, not just Kashmiri bodies, by these social networks that are daily generating new and as yet very, I think, difficult to pin down archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ananya. And I hope that we've now moved from FB India, FBI, to FBK, and we should the layering, and I mean the image, imaginary, and imagination, and how technology is enabling that. And the next paper is Dr. Dibyesh Anand. He's the head of, you all know him. He actually needs no introduction. He's the organizer, co-organizer of this series. He's the head of department and reader in international relations in the Department of Politics and IR here at the University of Westminster. His research areas include majority-minority relations in China and India, Tibet issues, and China-India relations. He's the author of Geopolitical Exotica, Tibet in the Western Imagination, and Tibet, a Victim of Geopolitics, Hindu Nationalism in India and the Politics of Fear, and of several articles and papers on security, identity, and Asian politics. He's currently working on a project on China-India border disputes and on colonial practices of the post-colonial states of Asia.
Thank you. I don't want to throw this out. Thanks a lot, Nitasha. In fact, I'll try my best to be even less than 15 minutes so that we have 15, 20 minutes left for question-answer. I mean, as we have seen, most of you have covered what I wanted to cover in a certain sense. I mean, what we see is usually Kashmir is looked at in terms of certain fetishization of borders, territories, and states. That's how it would be seen. And therefore, we had a context where it would be seen as a dispute between India and Pakistan, at most dispute between India, Pakistan, and China, where some may pay lip service to Kashmir as third party, but not as the most important party. And that's how it would often be framed. So when in 1990s, and I was a master's student then, and I was trying to read on Kashmir, all the writings were about simple India, Pakistan, and competing versions of nationalism, and somehow all three are equally important. Now, for practical purpose, they are important, but there's certain kind of fetishization that we need to challenge. The fetishization is where we assume that the existing states have a priori privilege over what narratives to tell. And that's something that we need to challenge, because this kind of fetishization is not only of state but also of geopolitics. And as my own, some of you may know, my interest started, I came to Kashmir via Tibet. And that's how I see myself. That not in terms of traveling, but intellectual traveling. My initial work was largely on Tibet, and it remains my main area of research. Colonization in a post-colonial setup, the idea of liberating the other. So Chinese claim that they have liberated Tibetans, the way Indians claim that they have got sort of liberated Kashmiris. So in that sense, we see a lot of commonalities, and of course there are differences too, I'm not denying it. But there's certain kind of geopolitics, statehood and border making taking place in the region, China, India, Pakistan specifically, where people don't matter, territories matter. And that's something I would like to challenge. Because state, and when you look at Kashmir, reporting about Kashmir, for instance, in Indian newspapers or even in Western newspapers, often, it's about security, law and order, strategy, conflict, sovereignty. So all these are language of power, not language of the people. And that's why I would like to try to express my disquiet with. Now, before I go on, I mean, often, even when we talk of, let's say, Azadi for Kashmiris or self-determination for Kashmiris or even something basic, giving equal human rights to Kashmiris, that Indian constitution provides. Even in that, often the retort usually we get is there too. What about Kashmiri Pandits? Now, most people who say, what about Kashmiri Pandits, have never cared about Kashmiri Pandits. So when Pandits had the exodus in early 90s, then they didn't care. But Kashmiri Pandit issue becomes a favorite issue to communalize it, to Hinduize it, and then always beat up Kashmiri Muslims by saying, what about Kashmiri Pandits? And I've not come across any single credible work that says, what about Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims? I mean, I'm talking of those who only say, what about Kashmiri Pandits? So it's almost an excuse there. But the second argument I have often come across is, but is Pakistan any better? Why don't you talk of minority rights in Pakistan and Bangladesh? I said, why not even Burma or Sri Lanka or Bhutan, Nepal? I mean, but the argument is always Bangladesh and Pakistan. Now, the fact is, of course, I mean, minority rights or situation of minorities in Pakistan or Bangladesh, let's say Pakistan in this context, is nothing to shout, there's nothing to be proud about. It is atrocious. But does that imply us being selectively silent about India because supposedly, according to them, India is a better democracy? I have no evidence, but that's what they claim. Or is the ethical position that, yes, we should challenge Pakistan or Bangladesh or Burma or whatever, but we should also challenge India? So often those who say, what about Pakistan, are those who would never challenge India, which is, I mean, we live in that bizarre setup. I mean, now, what I would like to talk about is, we need to move beyond that border, state, India, Pakistan, or for that matter, even Kashmir, to talk about even Kashmiris and to some extent Indians, Pakistanis and others. We need to talk of the people, because when we talk of Indian rule in Kashmir, and I'm focusing largely on India here, and we can discuss about Pakistan if you want during question answer, but India here, we have to look at how Kashmiri bodies and the bodies keep coming back. The disappeared bodies, the tortured bodies. So what kind of Kashmiri bodies exist? Of course, there's a living body, no doubt, but they are killed bodies, murdered bodies, mutilated bodies, disappeared bodies. And Parveena ji's own work, and other, as she pointed out, and there's no need for me to say that, how disappeared bodies, what kind of thing does it do to us? I mean, I just keep imagining, and that's why I was being very emotional. I was being emotional when she was speaking. I was imagining myself disappearing. I'm not a parent, so I would not understand how. I was myself disappearing, and what my mother or father would feel like, and not only disappearing, but forever disappearing in a certain sense, but not have even the certainty of knowing whether I'm killed or not. I mean, that's the worst kind of humiliation and torture that a state can do. And I was speaking to Parveena ji earlier. I said, and I would ask, and it's not being naive, but what do these people say? So when she goes to the military men or the court, what do they say? They say nothing. I mean, how much more arrogant can a state become where first they disappear someone, then they don't inform, then they don't have the courtesy of even apologizing for it, so that question of apology doesn't exist. And when you raise it, they'll say, the point is, so many people exist, so who knows? So that kind of arrogance. Now, Kashmiris have therefore bodies have been suffering through murdered, disappeared, tortured, half-widowed, raped, blinded, and in a sense, I mean, my closer interaction with Kashmir politically started last year after the brutal hanging of Afzal Guru, but also because of my interest in what was happening to kids who were being blinded by pellet injury. So that's how it started. I mean, at least closer interaction started with that. So blinded. And now imagine, it's not simply someone is blinded. Someone is 90% blind in one eye, second eye is okay so far. But facility doesn't exist, and as Mirza Wahid was pointing out, or someone was that, look, people are very anxious at taking the kids to the hospital in case the police will say who's here injured, which implies that they were somehow involved in stone pelting or something, and impose and put a case on them. Now, this particular kid, I was trying to sort of, I was interested in a certain sense. He lost one eyesight, 90%. The second eye was fine. But all the very senior doctors in Delhi and Aligarh were telling me that he needs to be treated properly because there's sympathetic blindness that happens. He needs to be treated. We tried, I mean, in the end it didn't work out, but we tried our level best. I tried to find out what was happening. The question was, the main anxiety, and I can understand why, of the family was, there was a case against the boy. The boy was only 12 years old. The case was that he had been involved in throwing stones. Now, interestingly, that case had been put very lightly. But once, let's say, we got involved, the local police, they increased the case, the severity of case. So then the dilemma was, do we struggle for justice for the kid or try to get him sorted out and remove the case? So those kind of dilemmas, I'm sure if someone like me who's an outsider, I'm not Kashmiri, I'm completely an outsider, if that kind of moral dilemma comes to me, whether to help a person or work for the collective, what to do, then one can imagine the kind of tortuous existence many Kashmiris have to lead every day of life, and Fozia's images and others' images also showed some of that, right? There have been mutilated bodies all around Kashmir and humiliated ones. So even those who are physically fit and there's no direct torture to them, there is a sense of humiliation all the time. Right? So they're not free, and that is the idea. Now, whether Samsung or iPhone or whatever they get, it doesn't change the fact that there's a certain indignity to being seen as someone who is occupied. And this is something we have to remember again and again, that Kashmiri bodies are the occupied bodies. And I don't need to explain why we call it occupied, because we have seen enough evidence of it. If this is not occupation, I don't know what would be occupation. But one ploy with which Indian state and Indian nationalists play is, first they'll say, oh, Kashmiris are Indians, right? So fine, you're Indian, why not? So that's the argument that that would be used. And then when you go to Kashmir and you speak to CRPF or paramilitaries or military men, they'll say, and I'm using it in crude language, ye sab sale chor hain. All these are thieves, or all these are traitors. These are Muslims. They'll always be traitors. And these are, this is a statement I'm giving off from the paramilitaries who control the state, right? Who are the visible face of the control. Now, so at one level, Kashmiris are Indians. Yet, they'll not be treated as Indians. It's like very weird kind of, what Mirza Wahid was pointing out and others pointing out, very weird kind of integral part that's integral but also alienated forever. And they'll never be fully seen as Indian. But the second ploy, which is more recent, I have a feeling, is that, oh, but you see, Kashmir has so many people. There are Ladakhis, there are Jammuites, then there are Paharis, and then the Gujars, and then the Kashmiri Muslims, and the Pandits, and the Sikhs, then the Shias, and the Sunnis. Yes, that's ethnographically correct. But if someone says there are different voices in Kashmir, and we are talking of the Indian occupied right now, of course, if you include Pakistan occupied, that's even more complex. Recognizing the diversity of voices is different from using the diversity in order to then say, therefore, there is no Kashmiri voice, and therefore Kashmiris do not deserve any right to self-determination. The fact that many Jammu Hindus may like India, or Ladakhis may prefer India, or Baltis may prefer, I don't know, maybe Tibet if Tibet becomes independent, right? That is secondary for me. But the way Indian nationalists would use these differences is always to break up Kashmir, or Kashmiri discourse, into so many fragments that the only option therefore is, look, India is a benign power that's trying to balance between Hindus and Muslims and Shias and Sunnis and everyone else, which is a very classic case of divide and rule of colonialism. So in that context, I mean, this is how I see Kashmir in general. So what does it say to me about India or Indians? I mean, what it says about India is that India is an occupying power. It is a colonial power. It may claim to be post-colonial, but it is very much colonial. the kind of post-colonial analysis we do about British Empire and French Empire and the everyday humiliation that involved of the colonized, we need to do about Indian rule in Kashmir. So in a certain sense, we have to bring back the lens which we use to critique empire and colonialism in order to critique and question Indian rule in Kashmir. What does it say to us about Indian nationalism? Let's not even go there. What kind of nationalism allows one to see someone like Parveena Ahangarji, see in Delhi, but say, well, what can we do? I mean, so there's something cruel and very dehumanizing about that kind of nationalism that exists in India. The fact that, of course, it happens to many in India, not only to Kashmiris, but the Nagas and the Mizos, or to Dalits, that doesn't change the fact that it happens to Kashmiris, right? So in a certain sense, and I'll conclude with that, is we need to look, when we try to critique or question or even analyze Indian occupation of Kashmir, we have to take into account nature of state, nature of nation, and nature of geopolitics, because India is not an exceptional state. It is very much a normal state. What India does in Kashmir is what Pakistan does in Balochistan, what China does in Xinjiang or Tibet, and many others. So what I'm saying is it's a certain kind of normalization, and we need to critique that normalization in academia. We have to challenge that. So in the end, and I'll conclude with that, what we require is an azadi. Azadi means freedom, of course, most of you know, and azadi not only of Kashmir and Kashmiris from India and Pakistan, but also azadi of others from the kind of nation state that exists in India, Pakistan, China, especially in that region. Now, when I say we need azadi for all people, including Indians themselves, I don't mean to trivialize the struggle for azadi of Kashmiris. So it's not that we need azadi of Indians first, then only we work for azadi of Kashmiris. No, all these struggles have to go on together. And therefore, at that, I guess it's a positive end. Let's hope for an azadi that's just, azadi that no longer disappears people, azadi that treats human beings more importantly than state. Thank you.
So quite clearly, hum kya chahte hai azadi. It's a slogan in Kashmir. So before opening the floor up to questions, let me just glean together some of these ideas. So I think that these papers fitted really well in drawing attention to the under-analyzed aspects of Kashmir. And as Andrew pointed out at the start, the progressive movement in Kashmir there's not enough looking back at that, and that draws attention to the way in which the post-colonial states had two conflicting impetuses. One was the imperial one, from the state, the empire. The other is the progressive one, and the progressive one is one we haven't looked at enough. In fact, Madeleine Albright's father, Joseph Corbell, he was at the time he wrote this book about the Red Terror on the Roof of the World or something like that. So at that time, Kashmir was a huge, big place of fear for the West, in particular for America, because it was seen as this a place full of communists. Fozia in the morning coined this or told us this phrase, post-traumatic democracy disorder, that we witness, and I think that through the circulation and through re-examining and creating a collage of those images, and how they are circulated, I think we saw how inheritance of the Kashmiris is not the kinds of things people normally inherit, but Kashmiris inherit separatism and they inherit nostalgia. We inherit these concepts as people inherit things. And that the visual disjuncture of the poetry and the politics. Ananya's paper on what I saw from it was this role of the visual in enabling rhetoric as well, and how images also have this kind of a facticity, isn't it? I mean, even though they're not, we sort of see them. People see them as having this kind of facticity in their character, and in particular the role of the pastoral, which itself in the romantic imagination, it gets constructed just as children get constructed, as innocent mountains get constructed as these beautiful places. And someone in the morning was talking about how they went to Kashmir, and I forget who, but how they saw, everybody was seeing beauty, and they just kept seeing the military, and it wasn't beautiful to them. Maybe, yes, you. And somebody else in the audience in the morning talked about the tapestry of resistance, and Dibyesh just pointed out how the states want to continually unravel that tapestry of resistance, and what we need really is just as the empire writes back in post-colonial stuff, we now need the peripheries to write back to these post-colonial empires. Let's have the questions.
We have 15 minutes.
15 minutes for questions, so.
Unless someone is done.
There's a question at the back.
Considering the situation in Kashmir and the players, India and Pakistan, is it possible to envisage a pressure from, say, the United States of America or the European country using the weight of business or other pressure points that could convince the Indians to become more humane in treating the Kashmiris and give the status and recognize the status of Kashmir as free people?
Who is that question? Who do you want? Do you want someone specifically to answer it, or the panel in general?
Free Kashmir, you're free as well, whoever wishes to.
Whoever, go ahead.
Should we take more questions?
Okay, we can have a few questions together, so maybe a couple more.
Yes, a question for Dibyesh. Dibyesh, do you see more similarities or differences between Kashmir and Eastern Turkestan political situation? Are both in transmission?
Question here, Shams. Here and then there, in the order that I saw them.
Hi, this is a question for Andrew White specifically, that this not looking enough into the progressive and left influence and left presence in Kashmir at that time, it's a bit puzzling that the government which was formed after partition or division in Kashmir, other side of Kashmir, was of Sheikh Abdullah's National Conference of the same party. And same party is ruling up till now most of the time. And usually, it is that these things are not looked back or did not, enough work is not done because people don't have resources or they don't have access. But when they were in power, they are still in power. Why you think that it did not happen? And anybody else can answer that as well.
Okay, and one other question, and then we have the panel answer.
There are two parts of the question. One is, हम क्या चाहते हैं आज़ादी? आज़ादी का मतलब क्या? ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह. So my question is that does this complete the slogan of Kashmiris today, and this captures the real mood which all of you are avoiding in sense of the society, and who takes the resistance, and those people who are carrying the flag, where they are going, on whose call, and what kind of phrases they are completing. Number one. Number two, you speak as a Kashmiri, I speak as Indian, one speak as a Pakistani. Where we are heading, I mean, what is so exceptional about Kashmir? It's another form of nationalism which will take over, and then what is so human in it? What was less human in Assam, where nobody writes about the Assami migrant, which is 5 million and much more poorer than the Kashmiri people. So it's contesting nationalism, so one will get it, and then the people in Srinagar will suppress the people in Kargil and their narrative. And this is what we already see in Indian Kashmiri who are articulate in English language, and Facebook revolutionaries who speak in English, and they are capturing all the narrative from other parts of the Kashmir. So what is so unique and exceptional? I mean, pardon my ignorance.
Okay, so let's take them in that order. So firstly, the question about the EU-US pressure. Maybe you want to answer that?
Oh, well, I'll answer all of them briefly and then pass it on. Yeah. So in terms of, as Nitasha pointed out in the morning, I'm not sure that actually US or European Union, or UK for that matter, are going to increase any pressure on India or Pakistan to do anything, so long as there's no conflict. So the preoccupation of diplomats here is for any kind of conflict to be prevented. So long as they don't fight each other and kill Kashmiris, that would be acceptable to them most of the time. Because we see what they do with China, with India, is business and not human rights. So they're not, I don't think it's going to increase the pressure. Second, in terms of East Turkestan, and I use East Turkestan and Kashmir, again, there are similarities, but I even see similarity with Tibet. And there's a deliberate reason why I use Tibet rather than East Turkestan to compare Kashmir with. But there's a very easy Islamization of Kashmiri movement. I'm not denying that Islam plays a crucial role, right? And many Kashmiris see themselves as part and parcel of a global ummah, and they see the pains of Palestinians, to some extent Uyghurs now, but not of non-Muslims. But it's a conscious political move on my part to avoid comparing them to East Turkestan and compare them to Tibetans in order to remind ourselves that this is not about religion or religious identity only. It's important, but it's largely about certain kind of occupation. And the last question, I mean, in terms of what's so unique, look, all nationalisms have their problem. But the idea is we live in a world where the imagined community is largely around nation-states and nations. Now, it's for Kashmiris to decide what kind of nationalism they are going to go with. It's not for an outsider like me to tell them, oh, only secular nationalism is good, and let's say, I don't know, some kind of Islamic nationalism is not good. It's for them to decide, and I do strongly feel that this is what self-determination is. Kashmiris, they have to have their own discussions and the freedom to decide what forms of identity to put forward and what kind of azadi to get. The fact that there are other oppressed, even let's say more oppressed people in India or in the region, I mean, that could be factually true, but that doesn't take away from Kashmir. So for instance, we could be talking of Assamese migrants here, or Bangladeshi migrant in Assam, or we could be talking of anyone else. So then asking that question that, oh, you are not the only victim, should not be an excuse, therefore, not to question the dehumanization of Kashmir that goes.
Okay, thank you. Andrew.
So why has the progressive tradition in Kashmir been largely forgotten when the National Conference remains the preeminent party in power in Indian Kashmir? Well, a number of reasons. Sheikh Abdullah broke with the communist left within a couple of years of coming to power, and they were broadly purged. You know, when I mean purged, I mean out. Baba Bedi, out. Loads of other people, not killed, but they lost their official positions. Just to make things more complicated, the Communist Party of India, just months after independence, took a turn to the far left. So it stopped collaborating with bourgeois parties such as the National Conference, and it went for supporting peasant insurrection, particularly in Telangana. So that was another marked change. But the basic problem is the National Conference today does not want to honour an armed Kashmiri force because, actually, fairly obvious reasons, armed Kashmiri forces have been causing the National Conference quite a lot of problems. This was a pro-India force, but the Indian government doesn't want to honour an informal Kashmiri armed force because the same reason. The militants don't want to honour armed Kashmiri force because these guys were fighting with Indian weapons for India. So all your three main traditions find it very convenient to largely write this out. And to be honest, there hasn't been a great deal. I mean, there are source materials there, but it hasn't really been the focus for a great deal of research. If I may, just very briefly on, what do we do to get India to be more humane? Well, it may not be very popular here, but I was back in the Valley a couple of months ago. The Indian government is more humane than it was 20 years ago, distinctly more humane. It may be a matter of degree, but nevertheless, there has been a change. International pressure has been, I think, a fairly small part of that, but it has been a part of that. When I was in Srinagar, as I say, in April, the overwhelming consensus was that the militancy was over and indeed had been defeated. When the Indian government says there are 130 armed militants in the valley, that's broadly what other people say as well, roughly. Doesn't mean he won't come back. Doesn't mean the situation in Afghanistan or change of policy by the ISI won't bring it back. But that's where we are now. That does not mean that Kashmiris are happy being part of India. That is clearly and categorically not the case. But it is a change that we need to take account of. And the other thing, which again is quite uncomfortable if you're in Srinagar and difficult to understand if you're in Islamabad, but from Delhi, Kashmir feels an awful long way away. And when people in Washington say that Kashmir is not one of the top 20 issues, in Delhi it doesn't feel to be one of the top 20 issues. It doesn't get a lot of political time. You don't get pieces on the opinion pages a great deal about Kashmir. And that's a real problem because you don't have an intellectual push to actually change things. And the Indian government has always been in a situation of containment. If you can keep the violence down, you just lock it up and carry on.
I just want to add, Dibyesh has already answered the last question, but I just want to add to that we don't get to talk to each other in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Definitely not to the other side across the line of control, and often not within what we often refer to as LOC East and CR. The opportunities are not there, so the conversations they don't happen. So what does a person in Kargil want? What does a person in Baltistan or Jammu want? We don't get to talk to each other, and we don't have the opportunity to form sort of a consensus statement, if you will. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a few comments which kind of respond to the last question, but going back to the first one, which was a very interesting question, in my opinion, talking about kind of high politics between states, but then to use the word humane, which kind of, made it a different kind of a question. Because I think if we are really asking what can make India more humane, I think we're really thinking about Indians, individuals, not the state, because whether there is a democratic process, more or less, electing certain individuals into power, etc. So we've got to think about we've got to break down the collective into a micropolitics of emotions and interest in other human beings through this idea of the humane, which I think is a really important idea. And not many people are doing this, bringing that word into a kind of question like you ask. So, and I think a very good example, unfortunately or fortunately, of this necessity on the individual level to display or try and cultivate a kind of humaneness towards not myself, someone else, was, I think, demonstrated by the final question, which to me was a little disappointing in the tenor that it seemed to introduce into the discussion. Can I just ask you a counter question back? You seemed very angry about something, and that anger seemed to be deflected onto the situation in Kashmir. I'm just guessing, because my job is as a reader of rhetoric and the reader of different people's expressions. From what you said, this is what I can deduce. Please don't take it personally. I'm just reading your question to us. And this kind of, I think it's really important. It may sound completely impossible to do on an individual level, but that is a kind of collective manifestation. I'm talking about the final question, where, when the question started by supposedly, as far as I can remember the different aspects of the question, it was in different parts. Sorry, I'm ventriloquizing you because you yourself gave the question. I don't know if it would be better to get the questioner to repeat the question?
The first part of the question was what about the religious aspect of the demand for freedom? So what if Hum Kya Chahte Azadi ended in La ilaha illallah?
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question was what about competing nationalism in other places that, like Assam and elsewhere?
So what I'm really interested in, this idea of competing victimhood, which I think is really in the way of us cultivating any kind of a individual humaneness, which then can somehow cumulatively affect not just political, but philosophical change, in the world. I may be sounding like just too utopian, but I think we need to somehow get out of the notion that it's only my problem, which is really important, because, I have really suffered, and nobody's interested in me, and someone, or one group of people that I'm interested in, and everybody's interested in another group of people. I think this is very dangerous as a political and personal philosophy, and I can only say that we all have the tendency in ourselves, because it's a very fundamental aspect of selfish human behavior, but I think we should try to not be like that. Sorry.
Yeah, that's Feroz.
I'm a Kashmiri, and I've lived in Kashmir all my life. At this point, we've been asked questions by many Indian friends that, you want an independent state. but what will happen to the minorities? But at this point, I see India as a Hindu state, BJP and the RSS in the power. So does it justify how I should ask them the question that what will happen to the minorities, be it Muslims or Christians in India right now? And a specific question for you, Nitasha, because I think you have the Kaul as your surname, and I will direct this question to you. That I'm being asked this question many times that you throw Kashmiri Pandits out of Kashmir, and I don't have a proper answer. I keep on juggling around answers, and I give them an answer which is not satisfying with them. So, do you think that question is right to ask? Especially Kashmiris like me.
Okay, we can.
What was that? I didn't hear that.
India was always a Hindu state. It's a misconception that it was ever secular.
We want to be modern, and I think the idea of modernity probably should try and think about different claims on identity, not just, a singular one, because that's the kind of world we live in.
I think just to give you a bit of context from what I know, I think that the person asking the question is not actually from Assam but also from Kashmir. So just to give you a context about that. I think Ananya's point about the ethics of alterity, the fact of the otherness of the other, I mean our ethical obligation to that which is not me and never me. And you still have to care about people simply because that is part of how you function as a human being. Otherwise, what's the human about this being? Exactly. The human part is the fact that you care for people who are not you. And also this, responding to those specific questions, there is in India a lack of a discourse on Kashmir. I mean, when people even speak about it, this lawyer Prashant Bhushan, he was beaten up. So even if people try and speak or write about anything that deviates from the standard discourse, you actually get this kind of hooliganism and religious right that attack them. And this is possibly, I'm saying this pessimistically, but I think realistically that this may increase in the future. As far as the question of freedom, I think when people say, what if freedom this, freedom that? Okay, fine, that's a fair enough question, but we haven't got to that. We haven't yet gotten even to that stage. It's not like we even have freedom is a process, and the freedom, in essence, even just to determine or even have the right to talk about determining, even there we haven't yet got with the state of militarization and oppression that we have right now. I don't think people are necessarily anti-India or anti-Pakistan. I think people are anti-injustice when they draw attention to these issues, and saying what about Assam, what about elsewhere, as Dibyesh said, and I think we agree, is that building up this calculus of oppression is not helpful to anyone, because it's like saying, don't care about the poor because they are the women, don't care about the women because there are the other minorities. It's simply a playing of the disadvantaged against each other for in economic terms, a small section of the pie, in political terms, a very small aspect of justice, even that those people are demanding. So I don't think that's helpful. I mean, it is a question that should direct one to look at the connections between injustices everywhere and build solidarity on that. Feroz, I was actually in Bhutan when I wrote Kashmir, A Place of Blood and Memory, this article in 2010, and on Twitter, and Feroz was and I remember interacting with Feroz on Twitter, and he asked me the same thing about, my surname. And of course, I am, from a Hindu rights point of view, I am a traitor, obviously, because I'm not talking about that which I should only be talking about. But, I'm talking as a human being, and I don't think it is a problem of Kashmiri Hindus or Kashmiri Muslims. I think it is a problem of Kashmiris affected by the state, and if only we could get that solidarity, we'd actually, the justice thing would be better. I get asked that all the time. Why are you talking about this and not that? But it's in a discourse, you have to see how your voice is going to sort of get co-opted into one or the other positions, and yeah.
He's bringing the mic.
Mic, we'll record Nitasha.
This whole idea of the victim, the burden of proof being on the victim, to explain actions in the future, to be crude and rude perhaps, is simply odious.
Yes.
When people are too busy counting their dead, for 25 years, 80,000 people dead, they really do not have the time or the space or the energy to formulate complex theories of what kind of state they may want in the future in 30 years. from now. I have all the sympathy for all the oppressed in the world. But when there's a soldier tearing down my door and is about to murder me, I will not think about people in Iraq at the time. I will think about saving my life or trying to war out the soldier. This kind of the solidarity with the other, with the oppressed and the suppressed and the occupied is all good, is wonderful, is important, and I think we should all do that. And by all means have empathy and sympathy for the other, but you cannot become the other. You would rather leave that burden, that story to the other. Assam, yes, there are people who suffer in Assam or in Middle India in the so-called Maoist belts, and they are oppressed and they are killed and brutalized. But what Kashmiris may do at some point to people in Kargil or Ladakh or Delhi, I can't answer that at this moment because, as I said, we're too busy counting our dead at the moment.
I just want to add to that a little bit. There were two things. One was what is special about Kashmir. To someone who is not Kashmiri, there may not be anything special, but Kashmir is special to us because we are counting our dead. We are living through the oppression and the violence. So as far as we are concerned, Kashmir is special. The second part as to what you were just saying, that asking the question as to what we mean by Azadi, is it fair? We may not be able to answer exactly what we mean by Azadi, but I'm very certain that we'll all be able to answer what we know by the lack of Azadi. That we're very clear on.